Hello and welcome to part 7 of my Saw 7 rewrite. This is the final part, which means you can find links to all 7 sections of the script in the description of this video. If you've been watching each of these videos, then you are well aware that the thumbnail art you see for all of these videos was done by Luke Headland. Once again, the links to Luke's social media pages are also in the description of this video. You can use those to find a lot more of his work. The rest of this video will be me discussing part 7, which means that if you have not read my Saw 7 script in its entirety, and you would like to, then please do not continue on with this video until you have done so. I did want to preemptively address something that I think could possibly come up at some point. In my script, it's established that the police department doesn't have Gordon's fingerprints on file, which is why they take those and his DNA when he is brought into the station. What someone might eventually point out is that in the original Saw film, when the detectives find Gordon's Penlight, Tapp gives it back to Carrie and says, "Get a rush on the prints." And then we cut to Tapp and Singh showing up at Lawrence's office, confronting him with the Penlight and asking him to come to the station with them. So it would be reasonable to conclude that they dusted the Penlight for prints and got a match for Lawrence Gordon, and that's how they found him. In which case, Gordon's fingerprints are already on file, and this whole thing about Hoffman switching the prints out doesn't work. But when you watch those scenes, it is never explicitly stated that they identified Gordon's prints and that that is how they found him. And considering there's no obvious reason to me why Gordon's prints would have been in their database or any criminal database that they would have searched, I think it's perfectly reasonable to suggest that there was some other way that they identified that Penlight as Lawrence's. As a potential hypothetical example on the clip of the Penlight, it's possible that there was a faint engraving of Lawrence's name on it that perhaps wasn't noticed when it was originally discovered and bagged up at the crime scene. But later, when it was brought back to the lab, and they went to examine it, perhaps that's when they would have noticed such an identifying feature. I don't find any of that to be much more of a stretch than coming up with some reason for Gordon's prints to have been in the criminal database. And I certainly don't find it more of a stretch than just accepting that the police never discovered Hoffman's fingerprints at these crime scenes, specifically the Gideon meatpacking plant. Now that we're finished with the script, I wanted to talk a bit about what Hoffman's plans were, just in case they weren't clear on paper. Because certain aspects of his plan obviously developed long before John was even dead, specifically the part about framing Lawrence. And so I think it's worth clarifying how that aspect specifically developed over time. The night that Tapp and Singh go to the Stygian warehouse, the night when Hoffman switched his fingerprints with Gordon's, in my mind, that was Hoffman taking advantage of an opportunity that presented itself without knowing that he would ever actually use it. Then later on, when John has started to accumulate all of these accomplices, and Hoffman is obviously not happy about that, I think it was obviously Hoffman's plan to start working alone once John was dead. He obviously took advantage of the opportunity to get Amanda killed. In Saw 6, we see him tell Jill that once they're through with William Easton's game, that he's working alone from now on. And as for Lawrence, I suspect that if Hoffman had not been ambushed by Jill, Lawrence would have soon found himself waking up in that furnace room. Of course, once he is ambushed by Jill, that's what gets Hoffman starting to think. If John wanted this done to Hoffman, when Hoffman was really the only one capable of continuing on his legacy, as far as Hoffman knew. What I'm trying to say is, out of the accomplices that Hoffman knew about, there was Amanda, Jill, and Lawrence. And when the Saw 3 and 4 games were being set up, there was also Art Blank. And so while there were quite a few aspects of those games that Hoffman himself did not take part in, there was no reason to think that between all of those other people, they weren't able to set those up without him. But then once Amanda is dead, and the two remaining accomplices that Hoffman knows about are Jill, who never took part in the abductions, and Lawrence, who really isn't physically capable of taking part in the abductions, then as far as Hoffman is concerned, he really is the only one left that can carry on the Jigsaw mantle. The fact that he was attacked at John's request is what starts Hoffman to suspect that there is someone else he doesn't know about. And when looking at the game at the zoo, and the fact that there were 9 other abductions that Hoffman didn't handle himself, it becomes apparent that there has to be at least one other person. The game in Saw 5 seems to have been set up by Hoffman alone. And again, everything from before John's death, there would have been no real reason for Hoffman to question whether or not the other accomplices could have achieved the things that he didn't take part in. The Umbrella Health game is the first time when it is obnoxiously suspicious. And even then, I don't think that it immediately occurred to Hoffman to question any of that because of what was going on with Perez and Erickson. Him being attacked by Jill is really what gets him thinking. And naturally, when trying to figure out who else might be helping with these sort of things, based on the established pattern, it makes sense that Hoffman would conclude that it's probably a former Jigsaw victim. And so when Pamela brings his attention to the fact that the Gordons lead a support group for Jigsaw survivors, that's the most likely place to find this additional accomplice. And so when he goes to the church and he encourages everyone to come to the police station and stage this protest, I think Hoffman's plan was to ideally get Jill to reveal to him who the accomplice was, and then be able to walk out of the building and kill that person if the explosion itself hadn't already killed them. And if he couldn't get Jill to reveal this person, I think he would have just gone out there and killed everyone that had shown up. So now that we've talked about Hoffman's plan, let's talk about John's. By helping come up with the Fatal 5 game, John was helping Hoffman shift suspicion away from himself. And at that point, Hoffman really would have the option to just walk away and have nothing to do with John's idea of Jigsaw or his own idea of Jigsaw. What happens to cause the plan to test Hoffman by putting him in that device to proceed is the game he puts the moneylenders into. The complexity of the games we see in Saw 5 and Saw 6, plus the fact that John definitively helped plan them, always caused me to believe that he had designed and built a lot of these devices in the 6 months before his death, or even in some cases in that 1 year gap between Saw 1 and Saw 2. And it made sense to me that there would have been a handful of games that were built without specific targets already in mind. And so when Hoffman takes it upon himself, without consulting the other accomplices, to use one of these games against people he wants revenge against, not to mention he would have allowed the winner of that game to die, that's the moment where it's like, okay, he's not taking this opportunity to walk away. He's going to continue this behavior. It's time to move forward with the test. But I do not believe that Jill was the one that was supposed to do that. It never felt right to me that John would have asked Jill to do something so dangerous. I think the only thing John wanted Jill to do was disperse the contents of that box to the intended parties. And I think that she was supposed to deliver the sixth envelope and the Jaw Trap 2.0 to Adam. And Adam would have been the one to ambush Hoffman, put him in that trap, and in the event of Hoffman's survival, Adam would have been the bait instead of Jill. But after Pamela gives Jill the copy of Amanda's letter, and Jill comes to realize that Hoffman essentially got Amanda killed, I think that's where she decides to handle it herself. And I think that's why she doesn't hand Lawrence his envelope in person. I think that's why she puts it through the slot in the door and leaves, because she doesn't want Lawrence to stop her from doing what she's going to do. I think that's just one example of a way in which John did not foresee the specifics of how these things would play out. I think the fact that Fisk and Erickson covered up Riggs' survival was not something that John could have predicted, and certainly ended up working to his advantage. But what I do think was the original plan was that Lawrence would try to secretly complete Riggs' recruitment, and together they would find a way to surprise Hoffman when he came for Adam. Obviously, a huge part of this script was exploring the reasons that each of these individuals would agree to become part of Jigsaw's work. And in my opinion, the only way that that would work is if there truly was a way for everyone to survive each of these games. Furthermore, I think what a lot of people find interesting about the Jigsaw character is the idea that he espouses about truly wanting everyone to survive and not intentionally killing anybody. But that really is only interesting if it is true. And I wanted to illustrate that as far as John's games go, it really is always true. And I thought the way to illustrate that to the audience would be to have it illustrated to the people being recruited. And the biggest example of that is Rig, as he and Lawrence are setting up the Saw 6 games. I think when you watch Saw 6, it really seems like there was absolutely no way that a lot of these people were ever going to make it out alive. In William's first two tests specifically, it seems like one life was meant to be sacrificed in each of those. And then when you get to the merry-go-round game, it seems suggested that no matter what, 4 people are going to die by the end of that game. And while maybe some people would try and write that off as, oh, well, at that point it was Hoffman doing things and Hoffman didn't care about killing people, I don't know for sure that anybody has tried to write them off that way, but I could see that happening. The problem is, John obviously was a crucial part of planning those games. The fact that you literally see him on the screen when some of these tapes are played tells us he was critical in planning that all out. Specifically, the first test with the ventilators, again, that one seems to be, when you watch it, demanding that one of them die. And John himself is the one explaining that test. So you definitely can't write that one off as being Hoffman. But as I illustrate in the script, what I think is interesting is if you really pay attention to any of the games that John designed himself, there does always seem to be a subtle way that they could have made it out. In the case of the ventilator trap, I have seen other people suggest that the rest of William's game really depended on him making it out of that trap alive. You know, if William somehow lost the breath holding contest to Hank, then the rest of the games wouldn't have played out and everybody would have been sitting there until, I guess, Hank would have made it out and brought help. Because Hank wouldn't have had the explosive devices to force him down the specific path. Anyways, people have suggested that if William had intentionally tried to lose the game, that would have released Hank. And I do kind of agree in the sense that I don't think that the clamps would have crushed William no matter what. What I don't completely agree with is the idea that John, in a million years, would have expected William to try and intentionally lose that game. But I do think that Hank had a way to disconnect his oxygen tube, and thus air would no longer flow through the ventilators and the clamps would not close in on him. And in that scenario, I don't think that would condemn William to die and get crushed. I think he would just be released after a certain point. I think I made this clear in the script, but that really makes a lot of sense to me based on what John explicitly says in Saw 6 in William's flashbacks. When William first tells John about his formula, John's whole criticism is that he's not taking into account the most critical factor of all, the will to live. He's saying that William can calculate all of these health factors and whatnot and decide how likely somebody's going to be to live. But what Hank would have perfectly illustrated had he disconnected his tube is that based on William's own formula and predictions, there should have been no chance that Hank would have survived that scenario. But by having that will to live, Hank would have defied those predictions. The gallows trap in the reptile room also has this really subtle detail that I think 100% proves that both people could have survived. Setting aside the possible scenario in which William and Hank proceeded to that room, in which case they both could have held onto a chain, and then maybe after a certain amount of time, the fact that the chains got so far apart that there had to have been two people holding onto them, then maybe the game would have ended and neither platform would have dropped. But setting aside that possibility, even in the scenario where William chose one life over another, this would have been another opportunity for him to witness somebody that he chose to let die surviving anyways, despite William denying them their life. And that subtle detail is that Alan's hands are released for 5 seconds before that platform drops. So if he had had the presence of mind, he could have wrapped his arms around the barbed wire cord. The platform would have collapsed and he would have swung forward, and that no doubt would have painfully cut into his arms, but it would not have cut his artery or broken his neck. And again, as we see in Saw 6, we see that after a few seconds, they would have been pulled up, theoretically to safety. And then with the merry-go-round, again, I think what John is trying to teach William is that he does not have the right to choose certain lives over others. So if he only lifted a finger to save each of them, he would find that that was within his power. But William is still not learning that lesson by that point in his game. And what's more is that if that would have just occurred to any of the people on the merry-go-round, if it had just occurred to them to ask him to try each time, instead of trying to compete and try to argue for why the other should die, then perhaps one of them could have gotten William to attempt that. Now, the other Saw 6 game, which I have obviously established that I do think was designed by John, is the opening trap with the scales. And I did talk about this in a video years ago, but I do 100% believe that there was a way for both of them to survive. That being, if the scale was perfectly balanced. If that were to happen, then I don't think the drills would have pierced either of their skulls. And how could the scale have been perfectly balanced? By neither of them adding any weight to it. The poetic irony of that game is that their predatory nature is being turned in on themselves. Eddie specifically resorts to self-preservation without any moral concern over Simone losing her life. And so he immediately starts tearing himself apart, which in turn forces Simone to have to compete with him, and ultimately this results in Eddie's death. And so while yes, obviously Hoffman is the one that put them in this game, and Hoffman didn't care if they both died, since I believe it was designed by John, I do think that there was a way for both of them to live. But now that we've talked about the beatable traps, let's talk about the unbeatable ones, because obviously my script features a handful of those. By the end of the sixth film, it is already shown how monstrous Hoffman has become. But I wanted to show on a series of games that John never even knew about the descent that Hoffman was going down. The graveyard game at the beginning is intended to have taken place sometime between the first and second Saw film. And by the end of the script, you learn that that was Hoffman's stepfather, who abused him throughout his childhood. The other three games that all occur in the furnace room, these all would have taken place between Saw 2 and Saw 6. We see that the furnace room is down in those tunnels. The first one is implied to be the defense attorney for Seth Baxter, the one that successfully got Seth's sentence overturned. The next one, the backstabbing game, was obviously on an internal affairs officer who we can reasonably assume caused Hoffman some career trouble at some point. And the last one is the vagrant we saw before in Saw 4. And what this sequence of victims is meant to illustrate is the slope which Hoffman is going down. I think a lot of people can understand why Hoffman would be so hateful towards the man that abused him growing up. To a lesser degree, I think we can kind of sympathize with Hoffman's anger towards the defense attorney. And then the internal affairs officer seems pretty damn petty. And then targeting Isaac, it almost seems like this is just Hoffman's idea of cleaning up the streets. And so basically you're seeing how Hoffman's view of the world, left unchecked, becomes more and more destructive and less discriminate. When coming up with those traps, the reason that most of them are in the same room is because, unlike John, Hoffman doesn't really care about preaching to the world. In fact, in order for his victims to continue believing that they have a chance, and therefore willingly inflict this torment on themselves, they kind of have to continue believing that they have a chance. If it became known to the wider world that these jigsaw games were occurring in which people did not have any chance of escaping, then theoretically a lot more people would just resign themselves to dying. And the suffering that they inflict upon themselves, I think, is a big part of what Hoffman is seeking. And so that's why Hoffman doesn't really want his games to be discovered. And that room down there in those tunnels is perfect for his purposes. And I think that that's a big reason why he wanted the house rebuilt. He presented that to John and the others as a way of maintaining and limiting access to the tunnels. But really, he wanted this very benign seeming house to give him easy access and hidden access to this horrific underworld, where he could do these awful things without fear of being discovered. As for the present day traps in this script, with the exception of Chris, I don't think Hoffman particularly cared whether or not Carla or Brett survived or not. These games were primarily to point Fisk in the direction of Lawrence, Again, Chris is kind of the exception, not because Hoffman wanted him dead, but because in order for his plan to work, he needed Chris to be dead and for his intestines to be dislodged. Out of the many unfortunate things that have resulted in it taking so long for me to complete and release this script is the discussion that seems to have grown around the subject of Adam and whether or not he could have survived. Now, admittedly, prior to early 2021, leading up to Spiral, and maybe a little bit earlier than that in 2020, I hadn't ever been on the Saw subreddit, and I wasn't super familiar with a lot of the online discussion around the Saw series. And so it is possible that the subject of Adam was more popular at an earlier time that I was not aware of, but it does seem to me that in the past couple of years, that subject has become a lot more widely known, and worse, pretty controversial. Like I said, I was on the Saw subreddit leading up to Spiral, and I don't remember ever seeing a post about anybody talking about Adam and whether or not he could still be alive. But in recent months, when I've really been trying not to get too engaged with the discussion, I have received multiple notifications about that subject coming up. But before I start talking about the discussion around this subject, let me go back to what my perspective on this issue was before encountering anything online. As I've already talked about in these videos, at a certain point, a few years into the Saw series, especially by Saw 6, it seemed very clear to me that Lawrence Gordon was still alive and was involved in the work of Jigsaw to some degree. As I have also said, the ending of Saw 3D and the complete lack of exploration of Lawrence's motives left me wanting, to say the least. There were a number of things that I felt should have been addressed, such as why he would be able to forgive John for putting Zepp up to killing his wife and daughter. Honestly, that was probably the biggest one, which of course I made it a priority to address. But another big issue I had was why Lawrence would have been okay with leaving Adam in the bathroom to die. And initially, my explanation for that was simply that Lawrence was still recovering when Adam was suffocated by Amanda. And when it became clear that John did not want that Lawrence kind of didn't blame John, which I think could have been made to work if handled the right way. But I think seeing John desperately try to save Adam's life and show remorse for him nearly dying, I think Lawrence seeing that, I think that goes a long way to convincing Lawrence that John genuinely did not want these people to come to lethal harm. Anyways, getting back to what I was saying, I do remember being aware prior to Saw 3D coming out of the apparent continuity error in Saw 2 where Adam's corpse has his chain on the wrong foot. And I was aware that it had been suggested that that meant that Adam was still alive. But at that point, I had never really taken that too seriously. And so when the urge originally struck me to rewrite the final chapter, I was already in the mode of accepting that what we saw in Saw 2 was simply a continuity error. But as I struggled with that issue of Lawrence and him being able to write off Adam's death, and the more I tried to find what I found to be a fitting ending to this script and to this series, the more I came back to the idea of Adam actually being alive. But even then, I wasn't convinced that it would work or that it would make sense. So that's when I started looking into it a bit more, and I actually ended up becoming convinced that this at some point had been the intention. I'm not saying necessarily for the ending, or even that they ever knew for a fact that they would end up going down that road. What I'm saying is that what we see in Saw 2, I am pretty firmly convinced that that was just a mistake originally. Similar to how at the start of Saw 2, when we see the video footage of somebody putting a key in Michael's eye and that figure is limping, I strongly suspect that when that movie was being made, they did intend that to be John, and he was simply limping because of how sick he was. But I think the theory that formed from that, that it was Lawrence, I think that that makes more sense and is more interesting. And ultimately, I think the filmmakers ended up embracing that theory. And I think a very similar thing had begun to happen with Adam in Saw 3. Again, I think it was an unintentional error in Saw 2. But I think Saw 3 responded to that and began laying the seeds for a potential future reveal that Adam was still alive. The first really big clue to that, in my opinion, is the fact that when Amanda brings Adam to the bathroom, John tells her, put his left leg in the shackle. Now, from a writing standpoint, there's no reason that he had to say, put his left leg in the shackle. In fact, he really didn't need to say anything. I think we would have assumed that Amanda knew what she was supposed to do once she brought Adam down there. But not only did they have him tell her what to do, but they had him specify which leg specifically to put in the chain. And I very much believe that this was done from a writing standpoint to draw attention to which leg was the correct leg for the corpse to have the shackle on. And that's not even the only clue in Saw 3 that the writers may have been laying the foundations for that to be revealed. Near the end of the movie, when Amanda is telling John that she's a murderer and that she killed Eric Matthews, John says, "No, Amanda, that's what you thought. But I cleaned up your mistakes. I forgave you for them." At the time that Saw 3 came out, we had no idea what he was talking about at all. And then Saw 4, it obviously makes a bit more sense because we see, okay, yeah, she thought Eric Matthews was dead. He wasn't. Another accomplice of John's has been keeping Eric alive. So obviously John knew that. That's what John meant about cleaning up her mistake. But the thing is, he said mistakes, plural. And we know he's not referring to Troy. And we know he's not referring to Carrie. And other than those two, the only other game that Amanda is shown to have sabotaged in any way is Adam's. And so not only do I think it's feasible that Adam could have survived Amanda trying to suffocate him, I think it was heavily hinted at. So if we are removing Saw 3D from the continuity, leaving only the first 6 films, and now recreating the finale to this story, I think it is not only within the bounds of believability that Adam is still alive, but that reveal has actually been set up and earned. Now, had this been the reveal at the end of Saw 7 back in 2010, I think that overall this would have been well received. And I think that it would have been largely unexpected. Again, I wasn't exactly active in the fan community back then, so I could be wrong. All I know is I was aware that Lawrence Gordon being alive and being an accomplice was a popular existing theory, while at the same time I was not aware of the Adam theory being equally popular. The problem with so much time having passed between now and then is that there has been plenty of time for other people to have pieced together what I see as very intentional clues that Adam survived. And then for that theory and discussion to become popular and ultimately a kind of eye-roll inducing idea. The reason that I think it is more controversial now than it would have been back then is because of how much time has passed and how many other directions these movies have gone in, that it would be kind of silly now to reveal in Saw 11 that, oh yeah, Adam's secretly been alive this whole time. I agree that that is ridiculous, and I can't imagine a way that they could execute that didn't feel silly as hell. And so for that reason, I agree with the people that are annoyed with this idea coming back up, or people suggesting that this is still the case in Jigsaw, Spiral, Saw X, the movies that now exist. But I think pretending that Saw 7 had it ended with this, I think pretending that that would have made no sense or would have been unearned, I very, very strongly disagree with that. And it is my hope that the script is written well enough that it illustrates that. I am a bit apprehensive that some people might go through the effort of actually reading my entire script, getting to the end, and then being angry at me because I went down that road. If those people are out there, I doubt they're still spending their time watching me talk about it. But if there's anybody out there that wasn't on board with this idea, but thought it made sense in the context of my script, I would certainly love to hear that. But okay, I think that's everything I have for now. If there's anything else you guys would be interested in getting clarification on, or some kind of criticism that you think maybe I've overlooked, I would really love to hear any and all of those things from you guys. Depending on how much feedback I get, I may come back with another video to address some of those comments. But whether or not that happens, I do fully intend on making more Saw content for this channel, some of which will be in the immediate future. And then after that, I imagine it will be a sporadic thing, probably every fall at least. So if you're still here and you would be interested in that future content, and you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as always, I hope you'll come back for the next one.
Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the two boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.